Hello and welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is American Ben. I know what you're thinking. Believe me, I've told myself it many times. Stop talking about child soldiers. Don't defend child soldiers. Especially after Alan just defended child soldiers. Eventually, YouTube is going to get suspicious. But in today's video, I have to defend child soldiers. And you know what? I think I have the right to do so because in general, my opinions are really moral. Aside from being slightly pro-cannibalism and child soldier, but whatever. Just kidding. I'm not pro-human child soldier, and people shouldn't be sent to war until they're at least 13. I said what I said in the beginning of this video because I just don't want to incur the wrath of ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence that implemented the Spartan programs in the lead up to the Human Covenant War. As you may know, ONI has engaged in a variety of tactics to recruit soldiers to their enhanced soldiers programs, and one of those tactics was kidnapping children. And I think that ONI has received a lot of heat for such actions, but I wonder if that is completely fair. In today's video, I want to consider whether or not the Spartan programs, with special consideration to the Spartan-II program, were ethical in their recruitment and training of their soldiers. Now, the Spartan-II program was the program that involved kidnapping and other questionable means of producing super soldiers. But it wasn't without reason that ONI did this. Rather, the failure of earlier similar programs made them change their recruiting strategies. Spartan programs started with the initiation of the Orion Program in 2321. ONI devised the Orion Program in order to increase the combat effectiveness of colonial military troops, the colonial military being the armed forces created by the unified Earth government in 2310. Though its intergalactic responsibilities would later be taken over by the UNSC. As part of the program, volunteers from different branches of the military and UNSC Marine Corps would be biologically augmented using the latest advancements in biochemical technology. Such augmentations included enhancements to the soldiers' muscles, breathing, vision, hearing, and brain function. Such soldiers would then be used in high-risk operations and other situations involving unconventional warfare. The original Orion program started with 5 volunteer test subjects, all who went through a variety of augmentations and testing. These results were determined to be unsuccessful, and so the program was shut down and the soldiers were placed back into active service. However, all 5 of them ended up dying within the year from what I assume are complications of the augmentations. Or as the 40K Space Marines would call it, weakness. In 2491, human colonized space was beset by civil war, with the unified Earth government and the UNSC on one side, and insurrectionist groups that wanted to be liberated from the UEG on the other. These wars threatened the colonial military administration's assets throughout space. And along with the UNSC's slow usurpation of their jurisdiction, the CMA was losing its power. In response, they secretly relaunched the Orion program, bringing in 165 new volunteer recruits from the UNSC Special Forces. The goal of the second phase of Orion was to learn from the mistakes of the first phase and create a true super soldier that could be deployed behind enemy lines and help to quash insurgencies. The new Orion program featured more advanced indoctrination and biological augmentation techniques, along with a harsh training program. The newly minted soldiers were successful in many of their early missions, but over time the insurrectionists became better and more organized, and so the number of active Orion recruits was up to 300. However, Orion operatives began to exhibit issues. Many older recruits suffered from PTSD, and others sympathized with the insurgent cause. Some recruits refused to engage in battle after augmentation and training and had to be imprisoned. Additionally, while the soldiers were successful in some of their missions, the results of the biochemical enhancements were underwhelming relative to the scientists' expectations. The poor results were largely attributed to the age of the recruits and the inability of the scientists to properly screen the recruits for specific genetic sequences. Thus, the biochemical augmentations produced only marginal enhancements in the soldiers' abilities. And the immunosuppressants inserted into them during augmentation often failed, leading to genetic fragmentation and degenerative conditions in the recruits. By 2502, around the time of Operation Kaleidoscope, a series of surgical strikes against leaders of various insurrectionist movements, the Orion soldiers began to develop severe side effects from their augmentations, including both physical and mental illnesses. As a result, the performance of the soldiers began to suffer, and in 2506, the Orion program was once again deactivated, with the remaining 165 soldiers reassigned to various special operations groups within the UNSC. However, many of these soldiers ultimately ended up discharged from the military due to the side effects of their augmentations. And the military administration covered this up by claiming that the mental and physical illnesses that the soldiers were experiencing were the result of a disease known as Boren syndrome. I should acknowledge that some Orion soldiers proved to be just fine and actually remained in the military longer than non-augmented humans, such as Avery Johnson, who served for over 40 years following the program's deactivation. Though, as most of us are already aware, Johnson was protected from the negative side effects of the augmentations by his overly large testicles. Anyway, what is important to note here is that age is largely what is thought of as the main factor that saw the Orion programs fail. For the most part, the adult recruits were already mentally and physically developed, and so their bodies rejected many of the augmentations. This is what the oft-demonized Dr. Catherine Halsey recognized during her implementation of the Spartan-II program, which began in 2511 and was known as Generation II of the Orion Program. Dr. Halsey proposed that the recruits to the program be adolescents, carefully selected according to their genes, and that such recruits possess superior physical and mental abilities. After being taken in, the recruits would then be trained to fight in and understand the values of war from a young age. Despite the program's controversial propositions, it was given the go-ahead from ONI's highest levels, as it was determined that the potential pros of the program outweighed the cons, but more on that in a second. All in all, 75 children, all around the age of 6 years old, of both sexes, were kidnapped from their families in order to keep the program a secret and inducted into the training and augmentation program. The abducted children were replaced by flash clones who would die soon after due to the imperfected human cloning process, which would lead their parents to believe their children were never kidnapped and simply died from medical issues. As the recruits were taken in and trained and augmented young, the Spartan-II program in the big picture was a huge success, developing super soldiers beyond what humanity had ever seen. But was the program moral? Was it the right thing to do? Well, that's the question. The first thing to go over is the training and indoctrination side. And to be honest, the easiest way to create capable soldiers is to train them young. It's much harder, for instance, to prepare 18-year-olds for war and to train them to have the skills necessary to be elite soldiers, though obviously it can be done. The Spartan Army, which is considered one of the most skilled and feared fighting forces in world history, trained boys from the age of 7 to be soldiers, exposing them to a harsh boot camp for the entirety of their childhoods where they ate, slept, and breathed war and combat. So while I have yet to defend the morality of training children for war, there is definitely practicality to it, especially in a universe rife with war. As for morality, well, in peaceful times, maybe exposing children to combat training isn't the most ethical thing to do. But if the defeat and extinction of the human race is a legitimate threat, then maybe moral exceptions need to be made. And with the onset of the Human Covenant War in 2525, it's a damn good thing the UNSC had the Spartan-IIs, because if they didn't, well, the human race might very well have succumbed to the aliens. And I know the point you're going to make here. The Spartan-II program wasn't devised with aliens in mind, and this is true. The Spartan-II program was implemented in order to combat human insurrection, just as the Orion program was. However, what many people don't realize is just how great the threat of the insurrection was. In 2491, Dr. Elias Carver, a political scientist studying the insurrection, published a report that warned of a massive, catastrophic war that would result from the smaller civil wars if drastic military action wasn't taken. In 2507, Dr. Catherine Halsey, a doctoral candidate, met Carver and began to study the conflict herself and improve upon his report. Halsey ran more than 1,400 simulations of the future and determined that in the best case scenario, the insurrection would lead to a massive rebellion of the outer colonies against the unified Earth government, and that this rebellion would lead to 30 years of war and 5 billion deaths, and ultimately enter the human race into a new dark age. Sure, ultimately the Covenant became the greater threat, but long before human contact was ever made with aliens, humans were well on their way to self-extinction. And yes, it's possible that Dr. Halsey and Dr. Carver and Oni were all mad and got their projections wrong due to confirmation bias and overzealousness. Though, on a side note, I want to make it very clear, I do not doubt anything that Oni has ever done, and if you do, I highly suggest you leave your name and address in the comments. Did Oni need to kidnap the kids rather than just clue their parents in on the program and ask for their permission in the name of safeguarding humanity? Hard to say, but taking 75 kids in the name of saving humanity seems rather reasonable. And if Oni was going to take children to make super soldiers to save humanity, then they were completely right to find the children with the genetic markers most conducive to creating elite Spartans. Just kidnapping the children bypassed the need for that whole permission thing and allowed them to look for the absolute best recruits and the recruits that would take best to the augmentations. The latter Spartan-III program recruited children as well, but rather than kidnap kids, they took in orphans who lost their homes and families to the Covenant invasion. And given the amount of people killed during the Human Covenant War, the orphan population proved to be a pretty good pool of candidates to select from. However, though the Spartan-IIIs came close, the UNSC has never quite matched the effectiveness of the Spartan-IIs, and I have to imagine that to some degree this has to do with the ability of Oni to basically select children from the entire population of humans with recorded DNA information. The Spartan-IV program, considered more ethical than the previous Spartan programs as it returned to using adult volunteers thanks to advancements in augmentation technology, produced soldiers that were significantly inferior to the Spartan-IIs and IIIs in terms of biological abilities. I should probably point out that 30 of the 75 Spartan-II recruits died, and 12 others were crippled from the biological augmentation procedures, and of the 33 who survived the augmentation, 2 more committed suicide upon running into their flash clones. Yeah, it's not the best look if well over half the kids you kidnap ends up either being killed or disabled. I mention this because I don't want to just pretend that the Orion and Spartan programs were ethical in any way. On the contrary, they were fairly inhumane and brutal. I actually think that Halsey and many of her colleagues were a bit maniacal and became obsessed with creating the ultimate soldiers. Ultimately, their program, whether ethical in its various parts or not, helped perpetuate humanity. And if you consider humanity worth saving, then Oni's actions with the Spartan-II program were justified. Sometimes you gotta do difficult and even vaguely immoral things in order to emerge victorious. Anybody who's ever played the board game Monopoly knows that, you sneak a property behind your siblings' back, steal some cash when they're not looking. Maybe that was just me, I don't know. Anyways, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments below what you think of all this, what you think of Oni's actions in implementing the Spartan-II and other super soldier programs. Remember to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. For now, my name is American Ben, and I'll catch you next time. Generation Films, peace.